Story 1. I remember that night clearly, even though it's been years now, because it changed everything for our family. My name is Mark, and I live in a modest house in a quiet suburb. At the time, my 3-year-old son, Jamie, had recently started experiencing these strange dreams and visions that I couldn't quite explain. It began with whispers and fleeting images, but that night, everything converged into one terrible, unforgettable hour. It was around 2 a.m., and the house was unusually silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing of my sleeping wife in the next room. I'd been tossing and turning in my bed, worried about the nightmares Jamie had been having. He'd told me he'd seen people coming out of holes in the walls and dancing in his room, and that they were trying to tell him something. More than once, I'd been jolted awake by his screams as he described shadowy faces in the dark. Faces that screamed at him in voices too guttural to ignore. I tried to remember his terrified eyes and the tremor in his voice every time he said it. But that night, it escalated into something entirely different. I woke up suddenly to a dull, echoing sound coming from Jamie's room. A low, almost rhythmic noise, as though someone were softly drumming. My heart pounded as I scrambled out of bed and crept toward his room with as much caution as I could muster. When I reached his door, I paused and listened. For a long, unnerving minute, there was nothing but the dark silence of the hallway. I pushed open the door slowly and shone a flashlight across the room. Jamie was there on his bed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was wide awake, his eyes darting around as if searching for something or someone. "Jamie?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he shifted on his bed and, to my astonishment, began telling me in a barely audible voice, "They're here. They're coming. They're trying to tell me." And then there was something else, something I can't explain. In that moment, as I knelt beside him, I saw it, a fleeting streak of white light that moved over his face. It was as if a thin beam of brilliance, out of place in the dark gloom of the room, had passed over him. I blinked hard, certain it wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. For a few agonizing seconds, everything felt suspended, and my mind refused to accept what I was witnessing. "Jamie, what did you see?" I asked, though I already felt I knew the answer. He continued in a trembling whisper. "Manya." That was the only word he managed to force out, a single broken word that he later explained was his name for the spirit he'd been seeing. I couldn't tell if he was terrified or resigned. All I knew was that his little face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. Before I could comfort him, a louder sound came through on our baby monitor, a harsh, commanding male voice that clearly said, "Stop that!" I froze. I hadn't expected the monitor to catch anything tonight. It was usually just a background hum when our 11-month-old son, Luke, slept peacefully in his crib. That voice, deep and angry, sent shivers down my spine. My wife, Lisa, and I exchanged terrified glances. We'd been trying to understand what was happening as Jamie recounted fragments of weird happenings from his dreams. Visions of dancing figures, whispered messages, and now that white light and the singular word Manya. In the days leading up to that night, he had also lain awake on multiple occasions, murmuring about faces in the dark that screamed at him. At the time, I dismissed them as bad dreams, overactive imaginations, or the normal fear of a toddler. But in that single terrible night, the entire atmosphere in our home changed. After that incident, when the voices and lights seemed to subside for a few unnerving minutes, I reached out to a mother-daughter psychic team we happened to know. Their reputation wasn't in the business of fantasy. They claimed to have a direct line to the paranormal, and several neighbors had vouched for their abilities. Desperate for answers, we enlisted their help. Over the following day, while I tried to make sense of last night's events, the psychic team tuned in remotely. I remember their voices on the phone, low and grave. They said they saw an evil old man's spirit from the 1940s hovering in our home, a sinister presence that smoldered like a dying cigarette. He apparently had a habit of walking among the living during his earthly years, and he now brought other lost souls along with him to cause mischief. They told me he even smoked an old-fashioned cigar, which correlated with the odd scent we had sometimes noticed drifting through the hallway outside Jamie's room. Although I'd tried to remain a skeptic all my life, Hearing their account made my skin crawl in ways I hadn't experienced before. The psychic team attempted a remote cleansing of our home, a ritual conducted over voice and energy from another city to rid us of the malevolent presence. Story 2. I was about 10 years old when it happened, the kind of experience that burrows deep into your mind and refuses to fade no matter how much time passes. Even now, when I step into a darkened kitchen at night, my pulse quickens and my chest tightens at the memory. Our house was small, tucked in a quiet neighborhood that seemed ordinary during the day, but took on an unsettling stillness at night. The walls were thin, and the creaking of the wooden floors echoed unnervingly through the silence. I had a habit back then, waking up around midnight to rummage through the kitchen for something to eat. It became so routine that I no longer questioned why I woke up at the same time every night. I'd make my way through the hallway, the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the frosted windows, casting strange, wavy shadows on the walls. That night started no differently. I shuffled into the kitchen, my bare feet brushing against the cold tile floor. The only light came from the two small windows above the sink, opaque so no one could see inside, but enough that moonlight crept through in a ghostly haze. I had my target in mind, the fresh loaf of bread my mom had bought earlier that day. It sat right there on the counter, waiting, but as I reached for the first slice, I felt it, a presence. In the corner of the kitchen, near the fridge, there was a pocket of darkness deeper than the rest of the room. It wasn't just shadow, it was wrong, like light deliberately refused to touch it. I stared for only a second, still groggy, telling myself it was nothing. Just my eyes adjusting, just my imagination. Then something hit me, a sudden, sharp slap against my face. My instincts flared. I wiped my cheek, expecting to find crumbs or something harmless. But what I felt wasn't bread, wasn't fabric, wasn't anything normal. It was fingers, long, impossibly thin fingers. I froze. A second passed, maybe two. Then sheer terror exploded inside me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just bolted toward my bedroom as fast as my legs could carry me. And as I ran, I heard it, felt it. Something was chasing me, not just footsteps, things falling behind me, objects crashing to the floor. Whatever was in that kitchen had moved. It wasn't waiting anymore. The hallway stretched longer than it ever had before, each step feeling like I was running through molasses. My heart hammered so violently that I thought it would burst. I reached my bedroom door, threw it shut behind me, and pressed my back against it, panting. Then I felt it, a sharp sting near my eye. I hesitantly raised my hand, my fingers coming away wet. Blood. My eye was bleeding. I scrambled to the mirror, my breath coming fast and shallow. There it was, a thin, shallow cut trailing down my skin, dangerously close to my eyelid. I had no idea how deep it was or what had caused it, but the fear, the raw wrongness of what had just happened, kept me frozen in place. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours wide-eyed under my blanket, ears straining for any sound beyond my own heartbeat. Nothing, just silence, as if the house itself had swallowed whatever had chased me. Days passed, then weeks. I never spoke about it. I was too afraid. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a bad dream. But every time I stepped into that kitchen, my stomach twisted into knots. Every time I saw the fridge, I felt an invisible weight pressing against my chest. Then one day in the sunlight of the afternoon, I traced my fingers over the scar near my eye. That thin, barely noticeable line. Proof. I had never imagined it. To this day, I don't know what it was. I don't go searching for answers because part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know one thing. I've never encountered anything that terrifying again. And I pray I never will. Story 3. I always tell myself I don't believe in ghosts. That's what I say when people ask me. I convince myself that there's a logical explanation for every strange thing that's ever happened to me. But deep down, I know that's a lie. I've been followed by something my entire life. The first time I saw it, I was 3 years old. I don't remember much from that age. Just a few flashes, vague memories of playing in the yard, the feeling of my mother's hand holding mine. But this memory is crystal clear. I was in my bedroom sitting on the carpet with my toys when I noticed someone standing in the doorway. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't my dad. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was just there. A tall, shadowy figure. No face, no distinct features, just a presence. Watching me, I screamed. Of course, my parents didn't believe me. They told me it was a dream, that I was imagining things. But as the years passed, the strange occurrences didn't stop. By the time I was old enough to understand that what was happening to me wasn't normal, my family had moved houses a few times. The activity followed. Small things at first, objects vanishing, only to reappear in strange places. Scratches appearing on my arms without explanation. My brother and I once saw a full-bodied apparition walk past a doorway while we were home alone. Even then, my parents refused to acknowledge it. Fast forward to adulthood. I got married, moved into an old apartment with my husband. That's when things escalated. At first it was small, bins flipping over, their contents spilled onto the floor as if someone had angrily knocked them over. Things would slide off the back of our vanity, things that should have been stationary. And instead of falling straight down, they would fly across the room, slamming into the footboard of our bed with alarming force. Never gently, never accidentally. It was always deliberate. We moved again, this time into a newer apartment. The activity died down. I thought maybe finally I could get some peace. Then we moved in with my in-laws while my husband went to school. That's when the nightmare truly began. The house seemed to breathe with something invisible, pulsing through the walls. The activity came in waves, each more intense than the last, and it always centered around me. My husband would hear me calling him from another room, but I hadn't said a word. He would see me, pass by the bottom of the stairs and follow me around the corner, only to find himself staring into an empty room. He swore up and down that he heard my voice calling him from different places in the house, even when I had been outside the whole time. But it wasn't just voices. One of the dogs in the house would go absolutely feral, barking, snarling at nothing. I would sit in the living room and watch her, terrified, as she growled at an empty corner. Her hackles raised, her teeth bared. Then the objects started flying. Small, soft items, things that couldn't possibly injure me, would suddenly launch themselves at me from across the room. I would hear clapping, actual hands clapping, somewhere in the house, followed by footsteps. The dogs would go chasing after the sounds, searching desperately for something that wasn't there. And then came the worst night. It was late, well past midnight, when the dog started again, losing herself in rage, staring into the empty center of the living room as though she was watching something move. She was barking wildly, snapping at the air, her body stiff with aggression. I had never seen her act that way before. I tried everything, calling her name, touching her back to snap her out of it. Nothing worked. So I left. I walked back to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm myself down. For a moment there was silence. Then the barking started again. I stepped back out, feeling my skin prickle with fear. The dog was still at it. I moved halfway up the stairs, crouching slightly so I could talk to her through the banister, trying to convince her to stop. She hesitated, then slowly walked toward me, her eyes still darting nervously to the top of the stairs. Then, the baby gate. A huge slam against the gate rattled the entire stairway. The sound was deafening. My gut told me, "Don't look." I forced myself to keep my gaze forward, pretending I hadn't heard it. The dog barked again, louder, angrier. I got her to stop. Then, as if to mock me, right in my direct line of sight, a pen slid forcefully off the table, sailing through the air before crashing onto the floor. The dog lunged at the invisible attacker, barking furiously, snarling at something I couldn't see. Her entire body was rigid with fury. I lost it. I ran, bolted down the stairs into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I was shaking, my breath shallow. My cat was curled up on the bed, his eyes half-lidded in sleep. He stirred when I sat down, sensing my fear. He came to me, rubbing against my arm, trying to comfort me. Then he stopped. His head jerked toward the doorway, his ears pinned back, his back arching, fur standing on end. He was looking at something. I didn't check. I didn't turn around. I ran. I grabbed my phone, grabbed my keys, and sprinted outside. I didn't go back in until sunrise. That was the worst it ever got. The years passed, and we moved again. This time I was careful. I refused to move into an old house, refused to risk stirring up anything that might already be lurking. We bought a very brand new home, one with no prior history, no lingering echoes of past lives. Since then, nothing, knock on wood. To this day, I refuse to talk about paranormal experiences inside my home. I don't know if whatever haunted me was attached to me personally, or if I just kept moving into places with residual energy. But deep down, I wonder, was it me all along? Did I bring something with me? Am I the poltergeist? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. Story 4, I moved into this place because it was cheap. That's really all there was to it. Second floor of a creaky old mansion that got chopped up into apartments sometime in the 70s. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a reset. Found the listing on Craigslist. 1 bedroom, weirdly low price, all utilities included. I should have known something was off. The building's in the oldest part of town, near the river. Not much traffic. Quiet at night. Too quiet, honestly. The kind of quiet where your ears start making stuff up just to break the silence. From the outside, it doesn't look haunted or anything. It's not falling apart or covered in ivy. But there's something weird about the layout. The hallways inside don't make sense. My apartment has this little door in the hallway that doesn't go anywhere. Opens to brick, like they sealed something off. I asked the landlord about it when I moved in, and he just shrugged. Said the building had been remodeled a lot over the years. I didn't think much of it until the whistling started. It was always late. Between midnight and 2 in the morning, I'd be on the couch, half watching YouTube, lights off except for the lamp. Then out of nowhere, I'd hear it. Just 2 notes. Low, soft, slow. A whistle, like someone trying to get your attention without speaking. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe the radiator, but it kept happening. Same 2 notes, same rhythm, same exact sound, like it was coming from just behind me. I'd get up and check the apartment. Nothing. Nothing in the hallway either. Nobody out in the street, and it wasn't like muffled through the wall kind of noise. It was in the room. One night I tried recording it on my phone. I left the camera running on the coffee table while I sat in the dark, pretending to scroll. About an hour in, it happened again. Those same 2 notes right behind me. I jumped and spun around. No one there, of course. I checked the recording later. Nothing. No sound. Not even background noise. That's when I started keeping the lights on. Not just the lamp. I mean every light in the apartment. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, everything. It made me feel less exposed. Less like something was hiding, watching me. It didn't help. Then my mom came to visit. She was in town for a weekend and stayed on the pull-out couch in the living room. I didn't tell her about the whistling. I didn't want to freak her out. But that morning she looked pale. I came out of my bedroom and found her sitting on the edge of the couch, hunched forward, staring at the floor like she was trying to figure something out. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked at me, and I'll never forget the way she said it, like she was still trying to convince herself it wasn't real. "I think someone came in here last night." I froze. "What do you mean?" She nodded slowly, still staring at the floor. "I woke up and there was someone, an older woman. She walked in and sat down at the end of the couch." Her voice cracked a little. "I couldn't move." I was already shaking. "Like sleep paralysis?" She nodded. "I thought so at first, but then I felt her. She sat down. I could feel the couch dip. I could feel the weight on my legs. It wasn't a dream." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there. She looked up at me and whispered. She touched me, pressed down on my shoulders, like she didn't want me to get up. My mom's not the kind of person who makes stuff up. She doesn't scare easy, but she looked broken. I sat down next to her, and she flinched, like she still felt it. "She wasn't angry," she said. but she didn't want me here. That was the last night she ever stayed over. But that's not the story. The story is what happened to me a few nights later. After my mom left, I couldn't sleep. I left all the lights on again, tried watching TV to stay distracted. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the whistling. Same notes, same rhythm, but this time it was closer. I muted the TV. Nothing. Then the air changed. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the room got thicker, heavy, the way the air feels right before a thunderstorm, only worse. My ears started ringing. Not loud, just enough to make me feel dizzy. I stood up, slowly, tried to look around the room without turning my back on anything. That's when I saw the couch. There was an indent on it, on the far end, like someone was sitting there. I swear to God, there was nothing there, but the cushion was sinking, slowly, like weight was settling into it. I just stood there, frozen. My phone was on the coffee table, but I didn't move. Couldn't. Then I felt it. The whistle, right in my ear. I didn't hear it this time. I felt it, like someone's mouth was inches from the side of my face. 2 notes, warm breath, sharp and cold at the same time. My whole body locked up. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My chest felt like it was being squeezed shut. And then, everything stopped. The air snapped back to normal. The couch cushion rose like nothing had ever touched it. The lights flickered once, and that was it. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't sleep the next night either. The night after that, I moved out. Didn't care about breaking the lease. Didn't care about losing my deposit. I packed my stuff, called a buddy with a truck, and left that place behind. I never went back. Never even drove past it again. Story 5. I was 11 when it happened, and even now, years later, I still think about it. It doesn't haunt me in the way nightmares do, not with fear or terror, but with a lingering unease, a question that refuses to be answered. We were visiting a lighthouse in Michigan, one of those historic sites tucked along the shore, weathered by time and whispers of ghost stories. My parents were eager to take the full tour with the guide, but after an entire day of visiting landmarks, I wasn't interested in another lecture on history. I wanted space, wanted to stretch my legs, wanted to breathe in the crisp air without listening to grown-ups talk about shipwrecks and maritime tragedies. They let me stay outside, alone. It was quiet, unsettlingly so. No other visitors, no passing cars, just the distant crash of waves against the rocky shoreline. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its presence firm and unmoving, like it had never belonged to this time or place. I wandered near the edge of the grounds, kicking at loose gravel, half aware of the wind twisting through my hair. Then the ball rolled up to my feet, worn, scuffed, deflated slightly at the sides. A child's ball. I bent down, picked it up, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers. It was solid, real. Nothing unusual about it except that it had appeared from nowhere. When I stood up, I saw him, a boy standing near the lighthouse, silent and still. He was maybe my age or a little younger, dressed simply, old-fashioned even. He watched me with a passive curiosity, not speaking, just waiting. I assumed the ball was his, so I tossed it to him. He caught it effortlessly, his fingers curling around it like it was familiar, like it was his. Then he wandered away. It wasn't strange, not in the moment. Kids played, things got lost, people came and went. I didn't think anything of it. It was only later, when my parents finished their tour, that reality shifted. We were walking back to the car when they asked about my time outside. Casual, just making conversation. I told them about the ball, about the boy. I helped this kid get his ball back, I said, thinking nothing of it. The tour guide stiffened. His expression shifted from polite neutrality to something harder, sharper. He looked at me carefully before speaking. There weren't any kids here today. I frowned. Well, I saw him. He was standing right over there. I gestured toward the lighthouse. The guide looked pale. He led us back inside, took me to one of the framed pictures displayed along the wall. Historical images, sepia-toned relics from another era. He pointed at one in particular. It was the boy, the exact same boy, holding the exact same beat-up ball. "Are you sure that's him?" My mother asked, skeptical. I felt my stomach twist. The collar of his shirt, the way his hair fell just slightly over his forehead, the way his hands gripped the ball. It was him. There was no doubt. The guide exhaled, slow and measured. That boy died here. My pulse skipped. My skin prickled with cold. I ran outside again, my parents close behind. We looked, searched, checked every corner. There was no boy, only empty space. The lighthouse loomed, silent and indifferent. Even now, I replay that moment in my mind. The small details that shouldn't make sense. Ghost stories are always about sightings. People see figures, hear voices, feel touches, but I touched that ball. I felt the weight of it in my hands. I felt the texture, the ridges, the slight deflation of one side. If that was a ghost, what did I hold? What did I touch? The thought unsettles me more than anything else, because in that moment, for those few minutes, it was real. The boy, the ball, the way he caught it so effortlessly. And yet, he wasn't. I still don't have an answer. I probably never will. Story 6. I was 7 years old when I experienced something that still haunts me. I can still remember that night in vivid detail, even though most of my memories from that time are fuzzy. We were at home in a small, unremarkable house in a quiet suburb. I lived there with my family, but that night it wasn't my parents who were with me. It was me, my 11-year-old sister, and our babysitter. We'd gathered in the living room to watch a cartoon on TV, a show that, to my young mind, was supposed to be fun and silly. The room was dimly lit by the flickering images on the screen, and everything felt normal, routine, as rooms often do on ordinary evenings. I remember sitting cross-legged on the worn rug, my eyes glued to the screen, trying hard to follow the antics of animated characters. My sister sat on the comfortable old couch, and our babysitter sat nearby, knitting quietly as she kept one eye on the TV and the other on us. It was a typical night, or so I thought. I was half aware of my surroundings when I noticed my sister suddenly stopped laughing. I looked over, and her face was unreadable for a moment. Her cheeks went pale as if the color had been sucked from them. I couldn't understand what had happened until I heard a barely audible sound escape her lips. A sound that should have been a scream but wasn't. It was as if her voice had stuck in her throat. I sat there frozen, eyes shifting between the bright TV and my sister's face, which was now void of its usual rosy hue. She stared ahead, wide-eyed and rigid, as if in a trance. Our babysitter immediately set aside her knitting. "What's wrong, Annie?" she asked in a trembling voice, glancing at my sister. But before anyone could react fully, my sister's eyes darted toward the middle of the room. I remember her whispering, "I saw him." Her voice came out choked and soft, but the terror in her tone was unmistakable. "A small, hairy man. He was walking right here." I couldn't understand what she meant at first, but the sincerity in her eyes told me she was not making it up. There was a long, heavy moment of silence. The TV's noise hummed in the background, almost indifferent to what was happening in the room. I wanted to speak, to ask her if she was okay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared fixedly at her face. My babysitter, whose calm voice had always soothed us, now sounded as if she were trying to convince herself that nothing was amiss. "It must have been your imagination, Annie," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed her own uncertainty. But my sister wouldn't stop crying. Her sobs started quietly at first, then grew louder, filling the room with an urgency that made my heart pound in disbelief and fear. I remember reaching out instinctively to try and comfort her, but I couldn't even bridge the gap between us. It felt like an invisible force was holding her apart, isolating her in her own terrified world. Then something else happened that made the entire experience feel impossibly surreal. I remember looking around the living room, trying to see the source of her terror. For a split second, everything seemed still, frozen around us, as if time itself had paused. In that moment, I felt a chill run through me, and my skin prickled as I strained my eyes in the darkness between the light of the TV and the shadowed corners of the room. Had I really just heard her, or had I just imagined it? My babysitter tried to reassure us in a way that only an adult can, though it all felt so inadequate. "It's all right," she murmured, taking my sister in her arms in a feeble attempt to console her. "It's just a bad dream." But I could see that neither of them truly believed it. Not my sister, whose eyes were still wide with horror, and certainly not me, because deep inside I knew something had shifted that night. I kept glancing toward the center of the living room as if expecting to see a figure materialize out of the darkness. I remember that my sister kept whispering the words, "I saw him. He was here, watching us," over and over. Those words echoed in my mind, loud and insistent, even though I couldn't see anything moving. The air felt charged, and I felt as if the room had grown colder, more menacing, as if what my sister said was true. When our parents arrived later that evening, they tried to get answers. My mother, trying to keep calm, asked my sister what had happened. "I saw a little man," my sister repeated, her small voice cracking with distress. "He was so hairy, and he walked right through the room like he wasn't even there." My mother frowned, dismissing it as an overactive imagination, a childish hallucination brought on by the dark, quiet room, and perhaps too many scary stories. But the look on my father's face was different. He was eerily quiet, his eyes dark and unreadable, as though he harbored some secret knowledge of what had really occurred. I didn't understand then what it meant that my father was silent. His silence wasn't the usual dismissal that I'd come to expect when adults talk to little kids. There was something deeper in his quiet gaze, a knowingness, as if he too had seen something he couldn't explain. That silence, that heavy, unspoken understanding between my father and the terrible truth of that night, has never left me. I remember my mother later saying that my sister must have been scared by a shadow or something that wasn't really there. She even tried to rationalize it by saying, "It's just your mind playing tricks at night, especially when you're alone." But I knew it wasn't that simple. That night, something very real had happened. More than that, I remember clenching my small hands in disbelief and fear, an overwhelming sensation that something otherworldly had stepped into our living room and brushed past us. The experience taught me early on that there are things in this world that do not conform to our tidy explanations. It was a single, distressing moment in my childhood, but its impact was profound. It shattered the innocence of my early years and introduced a quiet dread that whispers to me even in the light of day. When I share this story with others, I don't claim to have all the answers. I only say that I remember, with every detail etched into my memory, a night when the veil between what is seen and what is unseen was impossibly thin, and something from beyond stepped into our living room for one terrifying, inexplicable moment. And I will never forget that. Story 7. I'll never forget that summer evening. It should have been like any other night at my house. A quiet, ordinary night on Oak Street in our suburban town. I lived in a place that most people considered perfectly normal, safe, and predictable. That night, however, shattered every bit of that calm. I'm still haunted by what happened. It was early evening, maybe around 7:30 p.m. My sister, who's always been a lively presence in our home, was in her room reading, and I was downstairs watching TV in the living room. Our friend Marcus, without a doubt the biggest skeptic in any ghost story discussion, was staying over. We'd all been joking about supernatural stuff, teasing each other about haunted houses and ridiculous poltergeists, when eventually the conversation drifted to Marcus's girlfriend. We were casually dissecting every little detail of her quirks when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. I remember sitting in my sister's room, half listening to our conversation as I talked to Marcus about some recent misadventure he had with his girlfriend. Our voices were gentle, the soft hum of our idle discussion winding around us in the half-light of an old lamp. The window in our room looked out onto a darkening yard, and the world outside seemed quiet. Then, as if pulled out of nowhere, a sound erupted from the kitchen, an explosion of noise that was completely out of place. At first, it was almost like a distant thump, but then it became undeniable. Chairs being tossed violently, clattering loudly against each other, crashing onto the tile floor. The sound was so sudden and forceful that we all jumped. I distinctly remember my heart pounding as the noise reverberated through the entire house. "Did you hear that?" my sister shrieked, her voice a mixture of terror and disbelief. Marcus, who usually scoffed at anything paranormal, went completely silent. I could see the color drain from his face as he stared toward the sound. "It's coming from the kitchen," I blurted out, my own voice hoarse with fear. Without thinking, we all stood up and bolted out of the room. My sister raced toward the door, while Marcus and I exchanged a glance that said, "This isn't normal." I remember the sound so clearly, an almost rhythmic series of crashes and bangs, the unmistakable noise of furniture being violently thrown around. It wasn't slow, it was aggressive and quick, as if an invisible force had taken over the space. "We need to lock every door," I shouted, my mind immediately racing with possibilities. I grabbed the doorknob for our room and slammed it shut. Marcus and I sprinted down the hall toward the kitchen, our footsteps echoing in the sudden hush after the commotion. Before we could even get to the kitchen door, my sister's voice trembled from behind us. "Lock it! Press the alarm!" I glanced at Marcus, and his eyes said it all. He was as frightened as any believer of the paranormal could be, despite his usual cynicism. We hurried back to the hallway, and I slammed my hand onto the security panel by the door, pressing the panic button. In that moment, my heart was in my throat. I couldn't believe what we just heard. Minutes later, each one stretched long and agonizing, the security team arrived. I remember the piercing sound of their car cutting through the quiet of the evening as it pulled up outside our modest home. A couple of uniformed security guards knocked on the door, their voices calm and professional as they asked us what was going on. "We heard something in the kitchen," I explained, still trying to catch my breath. "It sounded like chairs were being thrown around. We thought someone might be breaking in." The guards exchanged a look, then motioned for us to let them in. Once inside, they checked every door, each room, even twice, as if expecting the chaos to start all over again. They moved into the kitchen, flashlights in hand, and methodically surveyed the area. Meanwhile, Marcus and my sister sat with me in the living room, huddled together, silent and wide-eyed. After what felt like an eternity, one of the guards came back. "There's nothing here," he said, frowning. "Everything's locked down, and the kitchen looks exactly as it did before the noise. No signs of forced entry, no loose furniture." His tone was measured, pragmatic, yet somehow it didn't match the terror in our eyes. I searched the kitchen myself. The once overturned chairs had somehow been set back neatly in their original places, as if nothing had happened at all. The countertops were spotless, and there wasn't a scrap of evidence to explain the violent sounds we just heard. It was as if the entire event, this chaos, had evaporated into thin air. Marcus, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak when we returned to the living room. "That can't be real," he muttered. "There's no way someone could just throw chairs around and then have them all disappear as if they were never moved." I saw him glance nervously toward the kitchen door, even as he spoke, his confidence shaken. But deep down, none of us were convinced by his reasoning. I knew what I had heard. I could still hear that sudden, violent noise echoing in my mind. I spent that night sleeplessly in my room, every little sound amplified, every creak a potential repeat of the terror in the kitchen. I tried to rationalize it later, telling myself that maybe a branch had hit the house or that the wind had done something impossible. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I remembered that moment, and the panic was as raw as if it were happening again. I didn't ask questions afterward. I don't think any of us did. Not really. The security team left with a final, puzzled shake of their heads, and by the next morning, everything had returned to a deceptive normality. The chairs were back in place, the alarm reset, and the night's events became nothing more than a series of blurred images in an otherwise uneventful evening. But for me, Marcus, and my sister, that moment left a mark, a chilling reminder that sometimes in the silence of an ordinary home, something inexplicable can occur. I've kept this story to myself for years, never daring to share it openly at first, worried that people would chalk it up to our overactive imaginations. But as time has passed, I realized that experiences like these aren't easily dismissed simply because they don't fit into rational explanations. Every so often, when I'm alone, I double-check every locked door, and I keep an ear out for any sound of chaos in the dead of night. I can still recall the feeling that night, the rush of adrenaline, the fear that gripped us all, and the eerie aftermath when nothing explained what had happened. It's one of those experiences that makes you question your reality, that pushes you to the edge of belief and disbelief. We never found out why the chairs had been thrown around, or who or what had caused it. But that single inexplicable incident changed something in me. It shattered the illusion that my home was a safe haven, free from the inexplicable. Even though the incident was brief, its impact was lifelong. I learned that one second, everything can be perfectly normal, and the next it can transform into something that defies understanding. That night remains in my memory, a traumatic, terrifying moment that still makes my skin crawl. I don't know if it was a burglar with an unusual method, a force beyond our comprehension, or just a trick of perception. All I know is that I experienced something that night that shook me to my core, and that truth is enough to keep me awake long after the world around me has gone to sleep. So if you ever find yourself in a familiar place suddenly disrupted by unexplained violence, remember? Sometimes the most terrifying events are the ones that leave no trace. Sometimes you hear the unexplainable, lock the doors in fear, and by the time help arrives, everything is as it should be. But the memory of that fleeting horror remains, gnawing at the edges of your senses, a quiet promise that the unexplained isn't always hidden in the dark. It can strike when you least expect it. Story 8. I never imagined a quiet evening at home could descend into outright terror. I still remember that night as though it were etched into my very soul. A night when every normal expectation was upended by something inexplicable. I live in a modest, two-story house on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. My family, my mom, dad, my younger sister and I, always felt safe here. But that night, everything changed. It was a warm summer evening, early enough that the sky still held a touch of dusk. We just finished dinner, and I'd settled into the living room with my family. I was sprawled out on the worn sofa, watching a movie, while my sister sat in her room doing homework, and my parents chatted quietly about the day. The ambience was relaxed. The house was filled with soft lamplight and the comfortable hum of the television. Nothing in that moment hinted at the nightmare to come. Out of nowhere, I heard it. A burst of clear, melodic laughter, light and musical, echoing through the hallway. At first, I thought it might be a recording, maybe a show that had started playing by itself, but as I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from the living room. It came from outside, like someone was laughing just beyond our front door. I glanced at the clock. It was around 8:15 p.m., so it wasn't particularly late for a visitor. I dismissed it as a prank or a neighbor's offhand joke, but then, almost immediately, a sharp, insistent series of knocks began at every door in the house. I leapt up, heart pounding, and called out, "Mom! Dad!" My voice trembled as I walked to the hallway. The knocks were distinct, rapid, almost frantic, as if someone were trying desperately to be let in. I scanned the darkened doorway, but on the other side there was nothing but a still, empty porch. My gut told me something was drastically off. Before I could process it further, the television in the living room suddenly sprang to life of its own accord. The screen flickered, as though seized by some unseen hand, and the volume fluctuated wildly. First, it blared an instrumental score so loud I could feel the bass in my chest. Then it dropped to nearly nothing before surging again. Every television in the house, which wasn't many but there were 2 sets, began doing the same thing simultaneously. The flickering, maddening volume changes, the unexpected channel changes. It was as if the very essence of electronics had been hijacked. I rushed back to the kitchen, which I always considered the most neutral, mundane room, hoping for some logical explanation. A blown fuse, perhaps a malfunctioning appliance. But as I entered the kitchen, I saw nothing amiss at first. The lights were a bit too dim, and I noticed that the overhead fixture was flickering, but the rest of the room was in order. Then it happened again, a sudden, violent clatter, as if something unseen had slammed against the door. I jumped, startled, and nearly dropped the coffee mug I was holding. My mom and dad must have heard it too, because within minutes, my entire family was out in the hallways, all of us reeling with a growing sense of dread. My younger sister, who usually giggled at the slightest spooky noise, was now silent, her eyes wide as she clung to our father's hand. My dad's face was iron still, and my mom's worried expression told me that even she didn't know what to make of it. Then the whispering began. At first, it was just indistinct murmurings that blended with the sound of the flickering TV and the rattling of the lights. But gradually, I realized that the whispering carried words. Words we could barely make out, but sometimes they seemed to reference us. I distinctly heard phrases that sounded like, "Don't you see us?" and "We're here," spoken in soft, almost pleading tones. The voices were barely audible, hiding behind the static of our frayed nerves, but they were undoubtedly there. I tried to reassure my family. "It's probably just a neighbor messing with a sound system," I offered weakly. But deep down, even I felt a chill that no rational explanation could shake off. The laughter, the knocks on the doors, the TV's erratic behavior, and that ghostly, inhuman whispering. It was like our entire home had been overtaken by something that did not belong to this world. I gathered the nerve to check the front door. I edged toward it, each step measured and heavy with anticipation. I pressed my ear against the cool wood and listened. All I heard was silence, punctuated by a final, distant peal of laughter, high-pitched and snapping my nerves like static electricity. In that moment, I felt a profound isolation. It was as if the presence that had invaded our space didn't want to be seen, only heard. We huddled together in a spare room, trying to make sense of it all, but the bizarre phenomenon played out before us like a cursed symphony. The lights continued to flicker erratically. Sometimes the whole house was plunged into darkness, only for the fluorescent tube to buzz back to life moments later. Every time the lights came on, I caught glimpses of shapes at the corners of my vision, shadows that quickly melted away, leaving me questioning my own eyes. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. I was glued to the spot with terror and curiosity, a feeling you only get when you're on the cusp between disbelief and raw, unfiltered fear. We kept the doors locked and the windows shut, but no physical barrier could keep out what we weren't sure was even physical. The sensations of those whispered voices kept repeating in my mind. They sometimes sounded familiar, as if the speaker was addressing each of us by name, recounting personal secrets we'd never told a soul. I remember my sister's eyes welling up, her voice trembling as she said, "They know things about me." My stomach churned as I realized that the phenomenon wasn't random, it was targeted. At some point in the span of what felt like an eternity, everything just stopped. The whistling laughter faded away, the knocking ceased, the TVs went silent, and the lights remained steady. An oppressive silence replaced the earlier frenzy, a silence that was as heavy and telling as any sound. We sat there, barely daring to breathe, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our heartbeats loud in the stillness. And then, just as abruptly as it had all begun, the event was over. In one continuous, horrifying incident, our home had become the stage for something I still can't quite comprehend. We never saw any sign of a burglar, and no tweak in the wiring or malfunction in our electronics could account for what we had experienced. That single, unexplainable incident left an indelible mark on all of us. Marcus, ever the skeptic, hasn't spoken much about it since, his voice growing quieter each time the topic was raised. My sister rarely sleeps now without a nightlight on, and my parents, especially my father, have always avoided discussing that night after the event. Yet each of us knows that deep down, our home remains changed by what occurred that summer evening. Although nothing has happened since then, I often find myself glancing over my shoulder or double-checking that every door is locked before bed, haunted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, it's not over. That night, with its violent chaos and sinister whispers, ended as abruptly as it began. And though my family eventually resumed our everyday lives with cautious hearts, the memory remains, a chilling reminder that sometimes, when you lock your door and press the alarm, the terror outside isn't always from an intruder in the physical world. Sometimes it's something else entirely, and it's a truth I carry with me, even in the quiet moments when I think I'm truly alone. Story 9. I live in Buckeye, Arizona. Hot, dry, nothing much going on except dirt, cacti, and the occasional monsoon. I was 15 when this happened. We had just put in an above-ground pool in the backyard, which basically made our house the place to be for the neighborhood kids. It was mid-July, and the air felt like someone holding a hairdryer to your face. My little cousin, Emily, was over that day. She was 8 at the time, Super chatty, loved dogs, afraid of bees, just a regular kid. We were all swimming out back, me, my sister Hannah, our neighbors, and Emily. At some point, Emily got out of the pool and went inside to get a towel. It wasn't even a big deal. She said she knew where they were. We kept splashing around, didn't think anything of it. About 2 minutes later, the back door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall. I turned around and saw Emily standing there, soaking wet, not saying a word. She was pale, like weirdly pale. Her lips were shaking, but she wasn't crying yet. She just stood there staring at us. Then she pointed toward the house and whispered, "There's someone in the room." "What?" I said, thinking she meant a burglar or something. "Who?" She looked straight at me and said, "A kid. He's all burnt up." Everyone went quiet, like dead quiet. I didn't know what to say. I remember just getting out of the pool and walking toward her, dripping wet, the ground burning my feet. "Where?" I asked. "In Hannah's room," she said. Her voice was shaking now, but she still wasn't crying. "He was just standing there smiling. His skin was all messed up." By now, everyone had gotten out of the pool and was watching us. I looked at Hannah, and she looked freaked out too. "You think someone's in my room?" she asked. I didn't answer. I just walked inside. Now, I'm not going to lie and say I wasn't scared. I was terrified, but I also thought maybe she saw a shadow or a reflection or something. You don't expect a child to see that. You don't want to believe they saw something real. I walked down the hallway still wet, water dripping off my hair onto the floor. Everything felt off. The house was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I stood outside Hannah's room for a second. The door was halfway open. "Hello?" I said, feeling stupid. Nothing. I pushed the door open slowly. And I swear to God, there was this smell, not just dust or old laundry, but something else, like burned plastic and meat. I've never smelled anything like it before or since. Her room looked normal at first. The bed was unmade, clothes on the floor, posters on the wall. But then my eyes went to the corner, by the closet. There was a kid standing there. Not a teenager, a kid, maybe 7 or 8. His skin was blackened and blistered like he'd been in a fire, but he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, and he was smiling. Not in a friendly way, not even in a creepy horror movie way. It was a dead smile, a wrong smile. And his eyes looked like glass marbles, cloudy and colorless. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at him. Then he took a step forward. I slammed the door and ran. I didn't stop until I was back outside, out of breath, heart hammering like it was going to crack my ribs open. Everyone was staring at me now. There's someone in there," I said. My mom came home not long after. We told her everything. She went into the room herself, said there was nothing there. No boy, no smell, nothing. She thought we were messing around, or maybe Emily had an overactive imagination and I'd just gotten spooked. I didn't argue. I didn't say another word about it. But here's the thing. Emily didn't make it up. That kid, whatever he was, I saw him too. Emily refused to come over after that. Even now, 3 years later, she'll barely talk about it. She just says, "I saw him. I know what I saw." I believe her, because I saw him too. We never saw the boy again, not once. But I've thought about him every single day since. And if you're wondering if it could have been some hallucination, some weird coincidence, maybe. But that smell stuck around in that room for days. My mom scrubbed everything down, even shampooed the carpet. Still lingered. Burnt plastic and rot. No source, no explanation. Sometimes I wonder if something happened in that house before we moved in. A fire, a death. We never checked. My parents didn't want to talk about it. I think they knew something was wrong but didn't want to deal with it. Can't say I blame them. I still live here for now. I avoid that room as much as I can. Hannah moved out the next year. She won't say why. Story 10. I live just outside of Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Quiet suburb, average house, nothing fancy. Our hallway's narrow and dim. No windows, no vents, just drywall and echoes. That's where we keep the whiteboard. It's mounted level, perfectly flush. Hasn't been touched in years. My dad uses it to scribble notes or jot down stuff for work. That day there wasn't anything on it. No scribbles, no magnets, just the tray and one black Stadler whiteboard marker sitting right in the middle. I wasn't alone when it happened. That's the part that messes with me the most. My dad was there. We were both standing maybe 1.5 meters away, leaning against the opposite wall, talking about the weird things we've heard in the house, just casually. You know how conversations like that go? The creaks at night, the cupboard that opens on its own now and then. My mom calls it settling, but I don't think the house is settling. I think something's in it. Always have. So anyway, we're mid-conversation. Not tense, not scared, just talking. My dad was leaning with his arms folded, and I had one foot propped against the skirting. I remember clearly that it was dead still. The hallway felt heavier than usual, like the air had weight. The door to the study, just to the left of the whiteboard, was shut tight. I had just said something like, "If it is a ghost, it's not doing anything harmful." And then the pen moved. No warning, no creak, no draft, no tremor. It was sitting still, then it launched off the tray. Not rolled, not tipped, not dropped. It was swept, deliberately, like someone had flicked their hand across the tray with just enough force to send it flying, not violently, but dismissively, like a bratty kid popping something onto the floor just to be irritating. It flew in a clean horizontal line, no arc, no wobble, no spin. It didn't tumble or flutter. It glided almost, like it was guided midair. Landed about 2 meters away near the skirting, under a side table. My dad saw it too. His head jerked at the same time mine did. We both watched it go. Nobody moved. I swear there wasn't anyone in that hallway. No cats, no kids, no pets, no windows open. The air was dead still. I felt it, still do, the silence before and after, like the hallway held its breath. I stared at the whiteboard. The tray didn't even rattle. No dust falling. Nothing had brushed against it. And that's the thing. The pen didn't slide off. It was pushed. It had direction, intent. My dad whispered, "Did you see that?" I remember not answering. I couldn't. My mind was trying to file it somewhere. Science, physics, gravity, something. But there was no logical shelf it fit on. He stepped forward slowly, like whatever did it might still be standing there. He bent and picked up the pen, held it in his hand like it was radioactive. We looked at the whiteboard again. It hadn't moved. Tray intact. The pen had been dead center on it. I'd seen it seconds before it flew. "Earthquake?" I asked. I knew the answer. South Africa doesn't get those. Not here, not ever. We've never even had a tremor. "No," my dad said. He sounded off, flat. "That wasn't an earthquake." Then came the part that truly got under my skin. He put the pen back, same spot, dead center, and we both stood there for 10 minutes, watching it. Nothing happened, not a wobble, not a shift. "Maybe it was balancing weird," he said, but we both knew that was a reach. The hallway stayed silent, cold, not freezing, but colder than it should have been, and heavy, like walking underwater. After a while, my dad just nodded toward the living room. "Let's get out of here." We didn't talk about it again that night. Didn't even mention the pen during dinner. I think we both knew that if we gave it too much attention, it'd become something else. Something harder to explain away. But I've replayed it in my head 100 times. There was no way that pen should have moved. Nothing touched it. Nothing nudged the wall. It wasn't on an edge or angled weird, and it didn't fall. It launched, like a hand had swept under it and tossed it aside. Like it was done being ignored. And the intent, that's what haunts me. Not the act itself, but the feeling that someone, or something, wanted us to see it. It waited until we were talking about it, until we were both looking, until it had an audience. That was 6 months ago. I haven't walked down that hallway alone since. And the pen? We left it there on the tray for weeks afterward. It never moved again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.